So, jumping right in, these are the main points I'm going to make today. It's very straightforward. So, in India, Buddhism incorporated the planets into their pantheon relatively late in history. It's only about the 6th or the 7th century. And then subsequently, you have astral deities, astral figures in mandalas. So, prior to this time, of course, Buddhists knew about the sun and the moon, but the 5 planets come relatively later. Now, Indian and Chinese masters apparently did not dogmatically adhere to the iconography of an original mandala, but were flexible in the presentation of the forms. I'm arguing that the mandala originally was just upaya, skillful means, which means that they weren't dogmatically committed to one specific configuration, that they could change it ad hoc at will. But conversely, the configuration of the mandala became sort of crystallized once it reaches Japan. So let's start at the beginning of the planets in India. So, as has been pointed out by scholars in Indology, the Vedas, the Pali Canon actually don't mention the 5 visible planets. They just know the sun and the moon. We take for granted the existence of 5 planets today, but the majority of people, if you ask them, can you point to Jupiter and Venus in the sky? They can't do that because if you don't have training, you probably won't know where they are. So the existence of the planets appears very suddenly in the religious record of India. So the Shiva Dharma Shastra, of course, has the evocation of the planets. Similarly, in Buddhist literature, you don't see Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, etc., until you have mature Mahayana. So maybe not until maybe the 4th or the 5th century. You don't see Jupiter and Saturn in the Abhidharma Kosha. You only see it in early Mahayana. So in India, you also have the evolution of the planets into 9. So you have the Navagraha, and that also includes Rahu and Ketu. And Rahu is this decapitated head which grasps onto the sun and the moon and causes eclipses. And Ketu was originally a comet. So comets conceived of as a planet. And then later it had a function like Rahu for being part of an astronomical configuration that results in eclipses. So there were 9 planets. Now, some of the early architects of Tantric Buddhism in China definitely talked about the planets. The 2 figures I want to focus on today are Shubhakara Simha and Yixing. So they translated the Vairochana Abhisambodhi, also known as the Mahavairochana Sutra. I think the better attested title is Vairochana Abhisambodhi, following Kano Kazuo in Brill's Encyclopedia of Buddhism. So they were responsible for translating this very important text, but at the same time, too, they compiled a commentary, which is extant. And the commentary is an interesting text because it seems to be the oral explanations and testimony of Shubhakara Simha translated into Chinese, and then Yixing occasionally adds comments here and there, or some other Chinese colleague or author also adds some explanations. And then the Vairochana Abhisambodhi became a major tantric text in East Asia. So Kukai, who we all know, studied under the Chinese master Huiguo, and he returned to Japan with the text and the associated mandala. And then in the subsequent generation, you have Ennin and Enchin also take back the same material to Japan. So it's in the 9th century that the text and the mandala both come to Japan. So what we're looking at here is a woodblock print from the 14th century of the mandala. Now, the problem is we don't know what the original Sanskrit rendering of the name of this mandala was. Often people translate it as Garbhadhatu mandala, but that's because the Japanese added the kai to it, which is the Chinese word for dhatu, but that's actually not attested in the original literature. And a more likely rendering would be Garbhakosha mandala. I think for my purposes, it's easier just to call it the Taizo mandala because this is the form of the mandala that is preserved in Japan. So the recensions of the mandala connected with the Vairochana Abhisambodhi were preserved in Japan but they're otherwise lost in China and Korea. So unlike the Vajradhatu mandala, which has been brought up before this morning, this specific one was preserved exclusively in Japan. And there is a mainstream version of it, which is called the Genzu Mandala in Japanese. So the illustrated mandala, which is basically the most mainstream form of the mandala. If you search for this mandala in Callbase in Japan, you can find very many different recensions of it. And actually, for our research, I would recommend checking out this website, Callbase. It collates all of the Japanese digital collections into one platform. So if you search for mandala or Vajra, you can potentially find hundreds of examples. And now we're getting feedback. Right. So just to give you an example of the sort of material I'm working with here, you can see the woodblock print is pretty well preserved, whereas when it's painted on silk, it can be a bit faded. We also have the SAT Taisho Zo image database, which reproduces the volumes from the 1920s and 30s, the iconographic catalog of Japanese Buddhism. And so these are the drawn, like the hand-drawn versions there. Now, looking at the mandala itself and its astral imagery, we see Mahavairocana at the middle of the mandala. Now, his name in Chinese literally translates as Great Sun Tathagata, and that's a literal rendering of Mahavairocana. Vairocana in Sanskrit is another word for the sun, but this is Mahavairocana, so he's the Great Vairocana. And of course, he's a prominent cosmic Buddha. He's not a historical Buddha like Shakyamuni, and he's at the center of the mandala, and he's associated with the sun. Now, that should be interesting in itself, but there's a bit of a problem, is that we also have the sun and the moon in the same mandala. So you have the Great Sun Tathagata, but you also have a sun on the periphery. And then when we look at the periphery of the mandala, well, we also see zodiac signs. Well, why would it be peculiar to see zodiac signs in a Buddhist mandala? Well, where do zodiac signs come from? Originally, they come from Mesopotamia, and then they go to the Greek world, to the Latin world. They eventually end up in India. And then it's around this time in the early tantric tradition that they start incorporating zodiac signs into the mandala. And then these carry over to Japan, and then these carry over to China, and then eventually Japan. So we can see all of the familiar zodiac signs on the periphery, as well as the planets, including Rahu, who is there to cause the eclipses. So why are astrological symbols in the mandala? Well, they connect with astrology, of course. And if we follow the commentary by Shubhakara Simha and Ishing, if you want to create the mandala, you have to do it according to astrological timing. You can't do this at any arbitrary time. You actually have to pay attention to the positions of the stars, the moon, the sun, and the day of the week. Whether it's Sunday or Monday actually counts. And all of these astral figures are deities, actually. They're devas. The zodiac signs are gods. The planets are gods and goddesses. Now, the positioning of the planets and the zodiac signs is not arbitrary in this mandala. The reason that you can see here in the east the sun and the moon in the west is that this actually represents the sun rising in the east in the morning and the full moon setting in the west. And this is at the time of the Buddha's awakening. So that much is clear here, but then the sun chariot is also positioned relative to Aries, Taurus, and Kirtika, the nakshatra. So there's 28 lunar mansions. One of them is Kirtika. Now, why is that significant? Because in Vedic mythology or Vedic lore, when the sun is rising with Kirtika, that's the vernal equinox. That's the time of spring. So what this represents is a specific point in time, the Buddha's awakening in the morning at a full moon at the vernal equinox. And so this is actually encoded into this configuration. And there's actually a precedent for part of this actually in the Mogao caves, because as Satomi Hiyama points out, you have the sun chariot and the moon chariot in this cave that is from the 5th or the 6th century, and it's also the sun in Kirtika here. So it is signifying springtime. That's like a very clever way of indicating spring. But we run into another problem, is that when we look at the reconstructed form of the Taizo mandala in the Tibetan tradition, as reconstructed by Tanaka Kome, we can in fact see a different configuration where Surya and Chandra, the sun and the moon, are not opposite one another, but they're actually in a configuration that would not allow for a full moon, because they have to be directly opposite one another in order for a full moon to be visible. So there's some sort of great divergence here in the configuration. And the other thing is that the Tibetan, according to this reconstruction, doesn't show the planets or the zodiac signs or the lunar mansions, the nakshatras. So something had occurred. There's some difference that evolved or emerged between what happened in East Asia and what happened in the Tibetan tradition. Now, when we look at the commentary to the Vairochana Abhisambodhi, it says, to the south of the western gate, position the lunar deva opposite the solar deva. And then to the flanks are the 27 nakshatras and 12 zodiac palaces as entourages. So what this means is that you should have the lunar mansions and the zodiac signs surrounding the moon, because the moon rules over the lunar mansions and the zodiac signs. But you don't actually see that in the Taizo mandala. And in fact, it's even more confusing, is that there's actually two moon deities in the mandala. You have Chandra, you can see him riding the goose chariot, and you have Soma, and he has the hare or the rabbit in the lunar crescent. And I think what that is that you have Chandra, who's actually the moon, and Soma rules over Monday, the day of the moon. So there seems to actually be two forms of the moon here. And although you're actually supposed to have the zodiac signs and nakshatras surrounding Chandra, according to Shubhakara Simha, they're actually divided into the 4 sections of the mandala. They're distributed across 4 sections. So again, there's a big difference here. And it also gives you the positions of the planets. And they're supposed to be retainers of the solar deva. So the planets are supposed to be configured around the sun, not scattered across the mandala. But again, you find this as well in this mandala, where the planets are divided into the 4 quarters, rather than being, strictly surrounding the sun, because the sun rules over the graha and the moon rules over the nakshatras, but you see this sort of separation into the 4 quarters like this. Now, the East Asian mandala is also intriguing for another reason, is that the extant version that we have in Japan diverges from some of the original iconography that was brought from India to China by Shubhakara Simha around the year 724. And there's this document in Japan, which I'll show you, is the Taizo Zuzo, and the monk Enchin brought it back from China, and it's apparently the original iconographical drawings that Shubhakara Simha had brought with him to produce the mandala. And it's actually different in some cases to what you see in the Taizo mandala, which became mainstream. But let's just look at a few of the pages here. The relevant pages includes the zodiac signs. When we look at these, we can see very familiar figures, but Capricorn has become a Makara, which is a giant fish, but I think he's actually a dolphin. You can see his nose here. He's probably some form of dolphin. Sagittarius is actually not a centaur, but probably a satyr, which is also significant as well. This is the only example in East Asia where Sagittarius is depicted with a half horse, half human body, but you don't see that anywhere else. It's only in this document, but the other ones should be pretty familiar. The nakshatras in the sort of typical Indian forms like this. You also have the planets, again, Rahu with his decapitated head, and the other planets the moon riding in a goose chariot with the hare on top. Now, when we sort of compare these to what you see in the Taizo mandala, you can see some divergences. So the number of geese in the original depiction differs from what you see here. So 3 versus that. And then Soma doesn't have the geese. He just has the lunar hare on the lunar crescent like this. But then when we look at Saturn, it becomes even more baffling because in the Taizo mandala, Saturn is an old man with a staff. And I mean, if you look at that, you think, well, maybe he's just an Indian sage or something, but he looks very different from what you see here. I mean, this figure here doesn't even have a beard. So what's happening here? Well, truth be told, is that we can actually see a parallel in Middle Eastern codices between these two images. Now, what you're looking at here is, this is how Saturn is to be depicted in the Taizo mandala. And then the counterpart Libra is Saturn holding up the scale. The reason for that is Saturn has his exaltation in Libra. So Libra is Saturn holding up the scale. And in the Arabic tradition, usually Saturn is depicted in a similar form as an old man, and he's supposed to be hunched over, but in this case, they gave him a chair. When we look a little bit more closely here, we can see parallels as well. So the reason that Libra is holding his abdomen like this is because in the zodiac, in the zodiac man, this part of the body is associated with Libra. But again, you can see that there's a big divergence here between what has happened. There's actually an even earlier precedent for depicting Saturn in this way. It actually goes back to the Greco-Egyptian tradition, at least as far as I can tell, where Kronos is depicted as an old man hunched over like this. And you could even notice that like the leopard skin skirt is present in the different illustrations. The reason for the leopard skin skirt actually could potentially be because Saturn is associated with celibacy, and the Egyptian priesthood, when they were practicing rituals, were also celibate. I'm not saying that there's a direct Egyptian connection, but Kronos in this depiction here is coming from a Greco-Egyptian tradition. Now, the question is, how did this image enter a Buddhist mandala? Well, when we look across the iconographical records in China and Japan, we see that there was a sort of a set of planetary icons that are not actually Indian in origin, but probably Iranian or Indo-Iranian. That's why the Arabic manuscripts often have similar images or similar icons to what you see in China and Japan. And so that filtered into the mandala in at least one instance. This is the famous painting of Tejaprabha Buddha and the 5 planets. And again, you can see Saturn. He is the Brahman associated with the bull. 3 of the other ones have sort of explicit Chinese costumes. So this is not Indian, but rather it's coming from some other source that's been synicized. Now, like as I pointed out too, that the satyr or the half horse, half man icon only appears in this document, the Taizo Zuzo, but then it's lost in the other recensions. And that's probably because when they looked at the horse legs, they didn't quite know what they were looking at. So it just ended up becoming like the end of a skirt, shantab, I guess, and the legs like this, because the artist didn't have a conception of a satyr or a centaur. So it just ended up becoming a bowman like this. Now, why do these differences exist? Well, the mandala, the Taizo mandala that we have is based on what Kukai brought in 806, and that's based on what the Chinese monk Huiguo had given him. But Huiguo's mandala had presumably changed since the time of Shubhakara Simha around 724. So between 724 and 806, there was modifications to the mandala in China. We don't know who did this exactly and when, but nevertheless, there's some changes that occur. But Enchin's manual that he brought apparently preserved the original icons from Shubhakara Simha's time. Now, in light of the commentary's discussion of astrology, I think Shubhakara Simha might have added the astral deities, because Shubhakara Simha, according to the commentary, understood Indian astrology fairly well. And so the original mandala might not have actually included them, but he figured maybe we should add them. I'm just guessing, I'm surmising. And then Huiguo's mandala probably used Shubhakarasimha's general model, but for whatever reason, you have some non-Indian figures inserted into that. That might have been a personal preference, or it could have been that the artists were basically drawing from different models. And it's not like they had like one large mandala and they all faithfully copied every centimeter of it, but they would have known, well, you put Saturn in this part of the mandala. Well, what does Saturn look like? And then you just look at the available examples that you have. But the point here is that some of the figures, the astral figures in the Taizo mandala, are not Indian in origin, but actually they have a sort of older Indo-Iranian heritage. And the Tibetan mandala was different from what Shubhakarasimha had introduced, because it only had the sun and the moon. So it's very clear that Shubhakarasimha and the subsequent generations of Chinese monks, including Amoghavajra, had the liberty to reconfigure the mandala. They weren't dogmatically attached to one specific configuration. But once it came to Japan, it became fixed. So once it's in Japan, there is a set way of doing it, and you're not supposed to modify it any further. So why is all of this significant? Well, I would venture to say that for Indian and some Chinese masters, the mandala was never intended to be a fixed thing. It was actually very flexible. It was an instrument that you used in order to facilitate awakening. So it's just a form of upaya. The object itself is not inherently important. You're actually supposed to visualize the mandala. And if you're visualizing it, then the actual configuration of everything is not necessarily so important. In Shubhakarasimha's own words, as it's recorded in the commentary, he says specifically that you visualize this treasured royal palace on the peak of Mount Sumeru. So this is an instruction he's giving to his Chinese students. So you have Mount Sumeru, the 4 continents, Buddhist cosmology, and you're actually supposed to be visualizing it, looking down at it, and the mandala is on top of Mount Sumeru like this. So if you are producing a mandala, it's just a skillful means. And actually, the commentary also even talks about how you can actually create a mandala on an open patch of land. Now, that doesn't mean that you paint each individual figure, but rather you make a flat surface with cow dung and mud, and then you draw the seed syllables, the bij, on it. So each of the deities has a seed syllable. So you could do that relatively quickly in a few hours. So again, it's just meant to be a temporary thing. It's just a ritual space. So the final point is that the Japanese treated what they received as orthodox. Nobody had the authority to change it. Even to this day, you're not supposed to change it. The object itself is inherently sacred, valuable, and powerful. It's an object of power. But I think earlier gurus had a flexible approach to the visual presentation because it was just a means to an end. And on that note, I would just like to also just tell you that my book is available if you're interested in the topic, and it's open access from Brill. Thank you very much.